It was a Tuesday evening, October 25th, 1994, in the small town of Union, South Carolina. The kind of evening that usually settles into quiet routine. But this night, something tore through that quiet, something unthinkable. A frantic 911 call sliced through the calm. On the line, a young mother, her voice choked with terror. Her name was Susan Smith. She told a story that would send shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. A carjacking, she gasped. A man, a stranger, had leaped into her car at a stop sign, forced her out, and then sped away. And her two little boys, Michael, just 3 years old, and baby Alex, only 14 months, were still inside. Gone. The dispatcher listened, trying to gather the facts amidst the panic. Susan Smith described the assailant, a black man, she said, wearing a knit cap. He'd wanted her car, her burgundy Mazda protege. She'd pleaded, she claimed, begged him not to take her children. But he hadn't listened. He'd just driven off, vanishing into the dark South Carolina night, taking her precious sons with him. The details spilled out, painting a picture of every parent's worst nightmare. A random act of violence, a mother left screaming on a lonely road, or so it seemed. The horror was immediate, palpable, spreading like wildfire from that one desperate phone call. Police officers raced to the scene, their sirens wailing, cutting through the usually peaceful countryside. They found Susan Smith, distraught, seemingly beside herself with grief and fear. She recounted the terrifying moments, the sudden appearance of the carjacker, his cold indifference to her pleas. Her story was relayed across police radios and the alert went out. 2 small children, abducted. The search, a massive, desperate hunt, began almost instantly. How could this happen? In a town like Union, where everyone knew everyone, it was a question on everyone's lips, a question that hung heavy in the night air. The search for Michael and Alex Smith was on. The initial moments of any such crisis are pure adrenaline, a frantic scramble for information, for any sign, any clue. The police officers on duty that night felt it, the weight of those missing children. They were looking for a ghost, a dark figure in a stolen car with 2 innocent lives hanging in the balance. Susan Smith's account was all they had to go on. A distraught mother, a stolen vehicle, and 2 little boys who needed to be found, and found quickly. The clock was ticking, every second stretching into an agonizing eternity for anyone imagining those children, alone with a kidnapper. The nightmare had indeed begun. The news spread like a shockwave, first through Union, then across South Carolina, and soon, the entire nation was gripped by the story. 2 little boys snatched from their mother. It was a story that tugged at every heartstring. The community of Union, a close-knit place, responded with an outpouring of support and determination. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers joined forces, their faces etched with worry. They couldn't just stand by. They had to do something. Anything. So they searched. They walked through fields, combed wooded areas, and peered down lonely roads, hoping, praying for a miracle, for a sign of Michael and Alex. Hope and fear became constant companions in Union. Hope that the boys would be found safe, that the carjacker would be caught, that this nightmare would end. And fear, a gnawing, persistent fear, for what might have happened to those innocent children. Candlelight vigils were held. Prayers were offered up in churches. The faces of Michael and Alex, smiling in photographs, were suddenly everywhere, on television screens, in newspapers, on missing posters tacked to telephone poles and shop windows. Their innocent eyes seemed to plead for help. The local authorities, alongside the FBI, threw every available resource into the investigation, following every lead, no matter how small. Susan Smith, the grieving mother, was at the center of it all. She appeared on national television, her face tear-streaked, her voice trembling as she begged for the safe return of her sons. "My children wanted me," she cried. "They needed me, and I wasn't there for them." Her pleas were heartbreaking, resonating with parents everywhere. Donations poured into a reward fund. The nation watched, sharing in her apparent agony, hoping that her public appeals would somehow reach the conscience of the man who had taken her boys. For 9 long days, this was the narrative. A mother's anguish, a community's solidarity, and a desperate race against time. But as the days turned into a week, and then some, with no sign of the boys, no trace of the car, a different kind of unease began to creep in. The searchers grew weary, their initial burst of optimistic energy slowly giving way to a grim resolve. The hope, while still present, was now tinged with a growing sense of dread. What if they weren't found? What if the worst had happened? The constant media presence kept the pressure high, but the leads were drying up. The story, so clear at first, was about to take a turn no one saw coming. A turn that would leave the community and the nation reeling from a different kind of shock. While the public saw a grieving mother, investigators, trained to look beyond the surface, began to notice things. Small things at first. Inconsistencies. Details in Susan Smith's story that didn't quite mesh with the emerging facts, or sometimes even with her own previous statements. Detectives are paid to be observant, to listen not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, the hesitations, the emotional currents. And something felt off. It was a subtle shift, a quiet questioning that began in the sterile rooms of the police station, away from the television cameras and the public's sympathetic gaze. Was everything as it seemed? Sheriff Howard Wells, the man leading the investigation in Union County, found himself increasingly troubled. Susan Smith's description of the carjacker was vague. She claimed he'd been at a specific intersection, but why that intersection? Why her? And why would a carjacker intent on stealing a car take two young children along with him? It added risk, it added complications. Most carjackers wanted a quick, clean getaway. The story, while horrific, had elements that seasoned investigators found puzzling. They began to revisit her original 911 call, listening intently, dissecting every word, every sob, every pause, searching for clues hidden within the raw emotion of that initial report. Her demeanor also raised quiet alarms for some. While she appeared distraught in public, some investigators noted moments of unusual composure, or statements that seemed rehearsed. During repeated interviews, her story would sometimes shift just slightly. A detail about the timing, the direction the carjacker fled, or her own actions. These weren't necessarily lies, not at first, but they were inconsistencies. Little red flags that prompted investigators to dig deeper, to ask more pointed questions. The pressure was on them to find the boys, but also to find the truth, whatever that truth might be. And the truth seemed to be eluding them, hiding just beneath the surface of a mother's sorrow. The sketch of the alleged abductor, based on Susan's description, was circulated widely. It led to a nationwide hunt for a black man who, as it would turn out, didn't exist. This focus on a phantom assailant consumed valuable time and resources. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the investigative team started to gently probe Susan Smith's life, her relationships, her recent past. Was there anything there that could explain the inexplicable? The search for Michael and Alex continued with fervor, but a parallel inquiry was slowly, painstakingly taking shape. One that focused not on a shadowy stranger, but on the very person who had first raised the alarm. The investigators knew they had to tread carefully. Susan Smith was, in the eyes of the world, a victim, a grieving mother, but, the nagging doubts persisted, growing with each passing day. They decided to ask her to take a polygraph test, a lie detector. It wasn't admissible in court, but it was a powerful investigative tool, a way to gauge truthfulness, to apply pressure. Susan agreed. The results, as investigators often find, were not straightforward, but they certainly didn't clear her. Instead, they amplified the existing suspicions. The needles on the chart seemed to dance around her answers about the boy's disappearance. Day after day, Sheriff Wells and FBI agents interviewed Susan. The questioning became more intense, more focused. They pointed out the inconsistencies in her story, the implausibility of certain details. They appealed to her conscience, if not as a mother, then as a human being. The strain was immense. For 9 days she had maintained her story, her composure cracking at times, but never fully breaking. But under the relentless, methodical pressure of the investigation, the carefully constructed facade began to show more significant fractures. The weight of her secret, whatever it was becoming too heavy to bear. Then, on November 3rd, 1994, 9 days after that frantic 911 call, the dam broke. In a stunning, horrifying confession to Sheriff Howard Wells, Susan Smith admitted the unthinkable. There was no carjacker, there was no abduction. She had fabricated the entire story. The truth was far more sinister, far more heartbreaking. She revealed that she had driven her burgundy Mazda protege to the boat ramp at nearby John D. Long Lake, and with her two little boys, Michael and Alex, strapped into their car seats, she had let the car roll down the ramp and into the dark, cold water. Her motive? A new man in her life who she claimed didn't want children. The confession led investigators to the lake. Divers searched the murky waters, and there, submerged, they found the car. Inside, just as Susan had said, were the tiny bodies of Michael and Alex Smith. The hope that had sustained a community, a nation, for 9 agonizing days, was extinguished in an instant, replaced by a profound sense of shock, betrayal, and unimaginable grief. The search was over. The boys had been found. But the discovery brought no relief, only the devastating confirmation of a mother's ultimate crime. The nation that had prayed for her, wept with her, now looked on in stunned horror. The trial of Susan Smith in the summer of 1995 was a media sensation, riveting a horrified nation. The prosecution laid out the chilling details of her calculated deception, her motive, and the deliberate act of driving her children to their deaths. Her defense attorneys argued that she was a troubled, depressed young woman, pushed to the brink by a difficult life and failed relationships, claiming she had intended to die with her sons, but had somehow exited the car before it submerged. The jury listened, deliberated, and then delivered their verdict, guilty on 2 counts of murder. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. For many, it felt like justice, but it could never bring back Michael and Alex. The Susan Smith case sent ripples far beyond Union, South Carolina. It forced a painful reevaluation of how law enforcement and 911 operators handle emergency calls, especially those involving alleged child abductions by strangers. Before this case, there was perhaps a greater tendency to take such initial reports at face value, particularly from a distraught parent. Afterward, while empathy remained crucial, a new layer of critical analysis and scrutiny was applied. Dispatchers and investigators were trained to listen more carefully for inconsistencies, for unusual emotional responses, for anything that might suggest a story wasn't what it seemed. The case became a grim textbook example in police academies. The tragedy also highlighted the immense pressure and scrutiny that can fall upon individuals, particularly mothers, in the glare of media attention during such crises. While Susan Smith was guilty of a monstrous crime, the case also sparked discussions about mental health, desperation, and the complexities of human behavior, even if those discussions were often overshadowed by the sheer horror of her actions. It served as a stark reminder that the most horrifying monsters are not always shadowy strangers, but can sometimes be found much closer to home, hidden behind a familiar face. A truth that is deeply unsettling for any community to confront. Today, more than 3 decades later, the names Michael and Alex Smith are not forgotten. They represent an innocence lost, a trust betrayed. Remembering them and telling their story matters. It matters because it honors their short lives. It matters because it reminds us of the vigilance required to protect children. And it matters because it underscores the profound impact such tragedies have on communities, changing them forever. The dark secret that unraveled from that one 911 call left an indelible scar, a lasting lesson in sorrow, and a call to remain ever watchful for the most vulnerable among us. Their silent faces still speak volumes.